The history of slavery. Slavery has been associated with hardship, subjugations, forced labor, bitterness, and all forms of rights abuses. That's why countries no longer allow the practice of slavery and slave trading to thrive or even exist on their land in modern times. Man's enslavement of another man is one of the greatest inhumanities ever perpetrated. But what is the history of slavery? When was this one of the most heinous crimes introduced to mankind? Tracing it to its origin. The simple truth is that no one knows exactly when slavery began. Slavery in this 21st century is no longer what can be explained in terms of warfare and rounding up of communities. It's now a big business generating some $150 billion in annual profits. While delving into the history of slavery, we must understand that there's a lot of misconceptions around it. The historical fact is that slavery spans many times, cultures, nationalities, and religions. It has existed from times immemorial to the present day. Also, its victims, the real slaves, have come from all ethnicities and religions. Meanwhile, the socio-economic, political, and legal positions and opinions of slaves and slavery have differed vastly throughout ages and places. When many people think about slavery through ancient times, their minds stop at 1619 when the first slaves arrived in Jamestown, a former village on the James River and the site of the first permanent English settlement. However, slavery has existed long before then. It didn't even start some 200 years earlier in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. When he landed in the Bahamas during his exploration, he found the native Taino tribe already enslaved by Caribs, their neighbors. These people thought they had found a savior who would lead them to defeat their oppressors. This means that as far back as before 1492, there was slavery. Caribs enslaved the Taino. But slavery predates the 15th century. The origin of the English word slave gives us a hint that slavery had existed before the Middle Ages. It comes from the Old French word sclave, which, of course, is a derivative of the medieval Latin word slavos, meaning slave. The word was formed from Slavos, or the Slav. The Slavs, the Eastern Europeans or Asian Russian who speak a Slavonic language, were often forced into slavery in the Middle Age. The mere thought of a Slav then evoked the image of a slave during the Middle Ages. That had been the situation even before medieval times. Slavs were captured and enslaved in millions by Muslims as far back as the 9th century, and the Ottoman Turks later joined in making the Slavs slaves. Thus, when many people think that the whites have always enslaved blacks, the origin of the word slave should conclusively adjust their historical perspective. Are Slavs white? Yes, they are. Yet the Muslims and the Ottoman Turks enslaved them. Hey, let me quickly clarify it before any confusion sets in. Muslims were not the only religion capturing slaves. Both Christians and Muslims captured as slaves each other during those centuries of Mediterranean warfare. Ariel Salzman, an associate professor of Islamic and world history at Queen's University, Canada, wrote in 2013, "Between the Renaissance and the French Revolution, hundreds of thousands of Muslim men and women from the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean were forcibly transported to Western Europe. Most of the other parts of the world, including the area now known as America, were routed by the slavery-monger Christians who would go with more sophisticated weapons around the world in search of people to be enslaved. That's the origin of the idea of the Bible on one hand, gun on the other hand during those inquisitions and crusades." Africans, not the only victims and not victims only. What about the notion that Africans were victims and not beneficiaries of slavery? Well, just as the case was in the Middle East and Asia, slavery had long existed in Africa. Africans have enslaved fellow Africans even before having contact with the West. If ancient Egypt was Africa, then slavery had existed in Africa some 5,000 years ago. Slavery had been operated in the first civilizations, like the Sumer in Mesopotamia, which, according to Elizabeth Tetlow in her book Women, Crime, and Punishment in Ancient Law and Society, dates as far back as 3500 BC. She says, quote, "In Sumer, as in most ancient societies, the institution of slavery existed as an integral part of the social and economic structure. Sumer was not, however, a slavery-based economy." The Mesopotamian and Arabians traveling around 3500 BC reportedly bought slaves en route and sold them to the ancient Egyptians who needed them for their unending magnificent buildings, including the pyramids, counted among wonders of the ancient world. In the Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi of around 1860 BC, copious references were made to slavery. The document recognized it as an established institution. The Mosaic laws written about 1513 BC strictly gave detailed regulation about every aspect of slavery to the Judists. It stated how someone could become a slave and how long he could remain so. It highlighted how slaves should be treated and how a slave could regain his freedom. For instance, it stipulated how much a slave could be bought and the conditions that would make someone sell himself into slavery. Slavery was common and legal in the ancient Roman Empire. Many people living in the empire were slaves, some proudly identifying themselves as slaves of certain rulers. There were laws in place regulating that societal practice. Those laws even contained responsibilities of slave owners towards their slaves and the state. The duties and limitations of slaves were expressly stated. There were strict official penalties for certain actions taken by slaves, which ensures the slaves continue subjection to their masters and lords. The simple fact is that slavery has existed throughout human history as far as its documentations existed. And it has been practiced by all people. The renowned historian John Steele Gordon says, "Slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved." We should therefore rise above the misconception that all Africans enjoyed the pharaonic status before the arrival of white people from Europe who turned their paradise into desolate wastes. By the way, even when the British, Dutch, French, Portuguese, Spanish, and other Europeans were trading in slaves across the African shores, especially on the continent of West Africa, were they waging wars and carrying slaves as spoils? No. They only engaged in what was known as the Atlantic slave trade, which started thriving in West Africa in the 1600s. Before then, Africans had been engaging in wars between communities, clans, and tribes. The losers in those wars had always become captives and converted to slaves to be used as forced labors. Europeans only exploited this practice once they too had learned how lucrative trading in humans was in Asia and the Middle East. Those days, Africans would sell fellow Africans to the Europeans, who had their ships on the shores for a token. In many cases, the prices of these slaves were ridiculous. A whole human could be sold for items as trivial as guns, mirrors, or gins. For example, the European slave traders didn't go into the interiors to round up the villagers as it was practiced before then. Rather, the black Africans tricked or forced their fellow Africans into the waiting ships of these Europeans on the coast. Slavery in modern times. What about modern times? Slavery is no longer legal anywhere in today's world. The moves to put an end to slavery started yielding results in 1833 when Britain passed a Slavery Abolition Act, thus becoming the first country in history to do so. France quickly followed suit by abolishing slavery in her many colonies in 1848. Then came the famous 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The end to slavery came at a great cost, which included the lives of 300,000 Union soldiers who paid the supreme price of freedom during the Civil War. It would be naive, though, to confine slavery to a relic of the past and one of the stark and dark historical realities. Slavery is still one of the serious worldwide challenges. How else would you describe child soldiers if they were not slaves? What about the thriving human trafficking and forced labor? Though the transatlantic slave trade no longer exists in the sub-Saharan region, Africans still sell fellow Africans to fellow Africans. It's no longer uncommon to hear about young girls being trafficked into Libya, Italy, and other countries. This challenge is not limited to the sub-Saharan region. Child prostitution also takes place in Europe, Asia, and everywhere in the world, even though illegally. A report finds that as of 2013, 40 million people were enslaved, the majority in Asia. The Global Slavery Index 2014 revealed that modern slavery still exists in all 167 countries covered by the survey. It gave the total of people enslaved to be 35.8 million. The GSI report also found that Africa and Asia continue to face the biggest challenge. In a December 2015 report about migrant workers' exploitation thriving in the Middle East and North Africa, it's found that in one firm, the passports of all their foreign workers have been withheld. 87% were confined to their workplace. 76% did not receive their full wage, 73% were exposed to psychological abuse, and 61% suffered physical abuse. International organizations and diplomatic missions always have big battles in their hands when attempting to deliver young girls who have been lured to another country by their relatives or friends who promise them lucrative jobs in greener pastures. The grim and shocking fact is that if you live in Europe or America, many of the products you buy are produced by slaves. But don't worry, that doesn't make you an accomplice in this illegality if you don't know. It's just to show you that the history of slavery is still developing.